Hey everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. I hope you're having a beautiful day and thank you so much for clicking to watch another one of my art videos. Today I'm going to be sharing my watercolor painting process for a little branch of eucalyptus leaves. I really wanted to do something fun and relaxing the other day, and I thought this would be a great opportunity to keep practicing my greens. And because I know that so many of you enjoy painting botanicals using watercolor and want to keep practicing plants and leaves, I thought of sharing my step-by-step process here with you guys in hopes that some of you will find it helpful or inspiring. Alright, so let's go ahead and get started with talking about this process. First and foremost, before getting into the painting, I just want to explain that the way that I like creating that preliminary outline sketch before getting started with my painting process is I often create my drawing freehand on a separate drawing sketchbook, and then I transfer my outline sketch using a piece of tracing paper onto my sheet of watercolor paper. Unless it's a subject that I've drawn or sketched a lot before, or that I feel I'm not going to have to do so much erasing with, I prefer doing it on the side and transferring it so that I don't erase so much on my watercolor paper, especially not when it's a higher quality, more expensive watercolor paper. If you watched any of my drawing or sketching videos, you're probably well aware that I'm a huge proponent for drawing freehand, and so creating that outline sketch prior to getting started with my watercolor painting is an excellent opportunity for me to continue practicing my freehand drawing. So I can kill two birds with one stone, so to speak. I first practice my sketching and I then practice my painting. Okay, so for this eucalyptus leaf study, I am using my St. Petersburg White Nights 12 color set. I am using 5 different colors, 3 for the eucalyptus leaves and 2 for the background. The colors I'm going to be using to paint the leaves are cadmium lemon, which can be replaced by lemon yellow or really any sort of light yellow color. Phthalo blue, which can be replaced with something like a Prussian blue, but if you like warmer blues, you can just stick to using plain ultramarine. And green, which is a very deep, rich green. And this one can be replaced with something like a hooker's green or even a sap green. I decided to go with a warmer green for this one because I'm going to be creating a green plus blue color mixture. Aside from that, I decided to paint in my background with a very light gray, and I create this gray by mixing together ultramarine blue and burnt umber. This combination creates a super dark, rich color, and I watered it down to create a light translucent gray. I am going to be painting on a sheet of Arches paper today. This is hot press, so it doesn't have very much texture on it, and I'm only going to be using one single size 14 round brush. Let's go ahead and get started with preparing the color mixtures that we're going to be using for the eucalyptus leaves, and then you can decide for yourself whether you want to paint your background gray as well, use a different color altogether, or leave your background completely white. Alright, so the color mixers that I prepare for myself on my color mixing palette before getting started is a light green. I combine my cadmium lemon with my green to create that lightest green. I also prepare another green, which is going to be pure green with a bit of water in it. In another little well on my color mixing palette, I prepare a mixture of phthalo blue plus green. And in the last one, I just have pure phthalo blue with water in it. By giving thought to the colors that I'm going to be using and preparing these different color combinations for myself before getting started, I know that I'm going to be able to create a nice variation in color throughout my leaves. And also, if I need to make a very light, more translucent version of any of these colors, all I need to do is grab a little bit of that color mixture, pull it out into another clean well on my color mixing palette, and add water into that. And that is going to make it more watery and thus more translucent or lighter in value. Whatever color combination you decide to use, just give thought to how you can create lighter green areas, medium green areas, and darker green areas, and make sure that you test out your color mixtures before actually using them in your painting. I would recommend always having a scrap piece of watercolor paper on hand, the way that I have right here, because I always make sure that the colors are going to look good when combined. if you're going to be using a pre-made green and you're not going to be creating your own by mixing together a yellow and a blue, then I would recommend just sticking to using one green and then creating variations of it by either adding some yellow into it or adding a color that is going to darken it instead of reaching for two ready-made greens. I always recommend keeping your color schemes as limited as possible because this tends to lead to much more successful color mixtures and a much more integrated and cohesive painting at the end. So when you're giving thought to the colors that you're going to be using, actually think about whether it's really necessary to bring in a whole separate color or whether you can actually create that color that you need by combining these two other colors that you've just previously selected, or whether maybe just getting rid of those colors altogether and thinking of a different color scheme with a less amount of colors in it is going to better enable you to create the different color mixtures that you need with a less amount of colors altogether. All right, so let me go ahead and explain what I am doing here. So when I am working with watercolor, I always like getting started with my lighter color first in a medium consistency, meaning it is quite watery, and I am always testing out my color mixtures on my scrap piece of paper before actually going into my painting with them in order to make sure that I'm not going in with a very saturated and dark color mixture right off the bat, because if I don't develop those lightest values first, or I don't plan for the development of lightest values and even highlights, I'm automatically limiting the wide array of different values and translucencies that I can create in my painting. Remember that value and translucency is very important when we're working with watercolor, especially if we're looking to create a higher sense of realism or give a painting more dimension and depth. If we don't think about developing a wide range of values, and with values I mean having lights, midtones, and darks, we're automatically going to be flattening out our painting and it's not going to look very realistic. So since my very first layer of paint, I'm already keeping lightest highlights protected, you can see little tiny areas in which I am allowing little sections of paper to shine through completely unpainted. Because remember that when we're painting with watercolor, our paper is going to stand for our lightest lights or our highlights. And it's this translucent paint in combination with the lightness of the paper underneath that is going to create those lightest values. And even with this very first layer of paint, which I am planning on creating maybe at most 2 different layers for this illustration, I am already starting to develop a wide range of values. I have my highlights, I have areas of lightest greens, and I already have some darker greens. So after having created that first layer of lightest green, I then have a good look at my reference photo, get an idea for where the darkest values are located within that leaf, and I start dropping in either my blue-green color mixture or my pure green color mixture in areas of darkest values that I'm able to see in my reference photo. Because I am dropping in the second green on top of paint that is still wet, I am left with a beautiful wet on wet effect, a nice soft transition between my lighter green and my darker green. This said, it is very important, especially because these are small elements, it's important to stay mindful of water control, because if we start dropping in the second green and we just go in with a large amount of water and paint in our paintbrush bristles, that second green is going to start overtaking the first lighter green, and you don't want to do that because the same thing happens. You're going to be flattening areas out, and the idea behind creating 3 different greens or a variety of different greens is to be able to see all of these different values and color variation. Careful with that, and always stay mindful throughout the process of A, how watery your paint mixtures are, B, how much water and paint you already have in your paintbrush bristles before going into your painting, and C, how wet your paper is before you drop in that paint. Throughout this process, you can even see how I am constantly removing the excess water and paint from my paintbrush bristles by blotting my bristles on my absorbent towel or gently scraping them alongside the top of my container of water or the walls of my paint mixing palette. Another thing is, the moment I feel I have placed enough color on my paper, I remove all of the color from my paintbrush bristles, I blot my bristles on my absorbent towel, and I go back in with a clean and only slightly dampened paintbrush and gently move that pigment around just a tiny bit. If at any point in time you feel you've placed way too much water or paint on your paper, go in and absorb it or lift it up with your absorbent towel, allow that section to dry, and come back into it later after your paper has dried. And I am by no means slaving over making my painting look exactly like the reference photo. I am just using my reference for clues as to value development, because I know that value is very important in giving this piece a little bit more of a realistic look. So I am looking at my reference photo mostly for ideas in terms of where lights are, where midtones are, and where darkest darks are. In pieces like this one, where there are so many little overlapping elements or little leaves that are curving in or in different ways, we also have to make use of our knowledge of light behavior and pinpoint these things in our reference to make sure that we are enhancing that illusion of things being curved in or overlapping and creating little shadows on each other. So I am continuing to develop that first layer of color all throughout my leaves, and as you can see, I am jumping around this piece as I am doing this. And the reason why is because I have to make sure that I am allowing those previous leaves that I worked on to dry completely before attempting to paint in areas that are right next to them. Because if they haven't dried completely and I start painting in a leaf that is right next to that area that I just painted in, then that color that I just laid down before is going to start bleeding into this new section that I wet. And so this is why I am jumping around between different areas of my painting. Always remember that watercolor is going to expand into paper that is wet. So whatever order you decide to tackle painting these leaves in, it doesn't really matter as long as you're staying mindful of whether that leaf or leaves that are next to or right around this next leaf that you're thinking of starting to paint in are still wet or even partially damp. All right, I am going to continue working on this first layer of paint all throughout my different leaves, making sure to get started with the lightest green, keeping little tiny areas of highlights protected, and dropping in my second green, which is my blue green or a more saturated version of my plain green in areas of darker values that I want to start developing. Once I am done with my first layer of paint all throughout my leaves, I'm going to be painting in the stem, and the visible sections of the stem I am quite simply going to be painting in with 2 brush strokes, one lighter green and one darker green, and all I have to do is I am going to make sure to leave a little sliver of highlight on the right of the stem. I'm going to be painting in the lighter green. I'm going to allow that to dry completely, and then later on in the process, I'm going to come back to the stem and paint in the darker green. All right, so I am completely done with that first layer of paint, and I have allowed my painting to dry completely, and I am now going to get started with the second layer of paint. This time I'm going in with a darker, more saturated green color mixture, and I am only placing this in areas of darker values that I need to develop. So I'm constantly looking at my reference photo for this, and I am going in with little abstract shapes. I am really looking at these little areas of darker values and shadows as abstract shapes. And those little abstract shapes are what I am painting in very carefully with the tip of my paintbrush. I am trying to stay away from creating any stark, flat, heavy looking shapes, as well as from creating any sort of visible stark outlines, because that is going to retract from the realism of this piece. Because I am going in with an even darker and more saturated color mixture this time, I'm being even more mindful of making sure that I am only placing the necessary amount of paint on my paper, and then once I feel it's enough, I remove all of the color from my paintbrush bristles and I go back in to do some gentle pushing around if I want to soften some edges, because we're painting wet on dry. The edges of the shapes that we paint in are going to be sharp and defined, as opposed to the soft gradiating effect that happens when we go in wet on wet. So if I want to go in and soften any edges, I can do that as well with a clean and slightly dampened paintbrush. All you have to do is run your bristles alongside that edge of that shape while that paint is still wet, and those edges are going to be softened out. All this said, it's incredibly important whenever I am working on a watercolor piece with various different layers of color, I just make sure to have in mind that the purpose of the second, third, fourth, however many layers of paint you're going to be developing is not to cover up the first layers of paint, but to continue developing a wide range of values and transparencies. You want to make sure that those previous layers of paint are kept protected in areas of lighter values, and also that you keep protecting those areas of highlights all throughout this process. A lot of watercolor artists create beautiful watercolor illustrations or paintings with only one layer of paint. Personally, I tend to go in with at least 2 in my very simple paintings, and the reason this is because I really like pushing that level of contrast and pushing those darkest darks. You can even see right here as I am working my way upwards how much more of a contrast these lower leaves have when you compare them to the leaves at the top. So another thing we have to remember is watercolor really tends to dry lighter than how it looks when it's wet. So I always like coming back to my paintings after the paint has completely settled and dried into the paper to see if I want to push some darkest darks in certain areas. When we're working with watercolor, I feel it's so important to always have in mind that it's very easy to start overworking our painting and even damaging our paper. And I feel that the more layers we start developing, or even the more moving around of our paint, the more washes we feel we need to lay down, the easier it is for us to start accidentally overworking everything. There really are no rules about how many layers you can or can't develop when working with this medium. It all depends on your own, style that you're going for and what you're painting, but it is important to move forward with some sort of plan and just stay mindful of making sure that you're not going over certain areas that don't need any more work in them, as well as remembering to allow a layer to dry completely before going in and attempting to darken a certain area inside of it or add details and things like that. It's very easy for a watercolor painting to start losing its freshness and that glowy feel that watercolor paint allows. And by going into the same spot again and again and again, not only are we going to be flattening areas out, because all of the different values that we've previously created are going to start merging together, as well as maybe even damage our paper, But we can also start creating mud, especially if we're using complementary colors in our painting or colors that are very different from each other. And this is something that I talked about in a recent YouTube video in which I share lots of essential tips to know on how to avoid muddy colors. I highly recommend checking that one out if you haven't already. In this particular case, muddy colors are not so much of a problem because we're using analogous colors in the color wheel. Blue is next to green in the color wheel, and green is a secondary color that is created by mixing together blue and yellow. But even with this, it's important to try to communicate or describe what we want to describe with as least layers and brushstrokes as possible, I feel. Unless we're going for a hyper-realistic painting with watercolor, in which case it's still very important to protect those lightest lights, develop a wide range of values, which is so important in realism, and make sure that you're approaching everything in well thought out layers and allowing layers to dry completely in between. All of these are things that I am continuing to work on myself as I move on in my journey with watercolor. It can definitely be tricky for someone who started with painting with acrylics and oils, which are opaque painting mediums, which I know that a lot of you out there are probably on the same boat. It can be tricky to move on to something like watercolor, which is a completely different process and it's a very different outcome that we're going for. All right, I'm gonna finish up with carving out those darkest darks in this second layer of paint. I am continuing to jump around very loosely, and really less is more in this part of the process. Once I am done, it's gonna be time to start painting in that background. Okay, so I am done with the leaves and I am now creating my gray color mixture by mixing together ultramarine blue and burnt umber. I am running out of my burnt umber from my St. Petersburg set, so I grabbed some burnt umber from my Van Gogh set. If you've never created this dark color combination before, I highly recommend shifting around the ratios of your blue and your burnt umber until you arrive at a gray. Because if you have more blue than brown in your color mixture, it's gonna look like a dark blue. And if you have more brown than blue in your color mixture, it's gonna look like a dark brown. You want something right in the middle, you want a gray. So test it out on a scrap piece of watercolor paper as much as you need to. And once you've arrived at a good color mixture that looks like a gray, bring a little bit of that color mixture out into another area of your color mixing palette or another well of your color mixing palette. Add water into that to get it nice and watery and translucent, and then you're gonna go ahead and start painting your background wet on dry. You can see how I am working section by section, and whenever I feel I am running out of my gray, I grab a little bit more from that dark puddle. I bring it over onto another well and add more water into that, and then I go back in to work in the next section. And I move that paint around a tiny bit, but I also try to embrace those little organic effects that happen along the way because they provide points of interest and a bit of texture in the background. Alright everyone, that is going to do it for today's video. I really hope that you enjoyed it, that you learned something new, or that you found it inspiring. If you did like it, please make sure to give this video a thumbs up because it really helps support the work that I am doing here on YouTube and allows more artists to get to know about my channel. Thank you so very much for watching today. I really appreciate it. If you have any questions or comments for me, make sure to leave them down below in the comment section. I always love hearing from you guys and read every single one of your comments. Don't forget to subscribe so that I can see you next week for another video, and stay inspired. Bye guys!